Between 1850 and 1885, four men carved empires out of the Texas dirt that nobody else wanted. One started with 242 cattle and 6 horses. Another paid $300 for 15,500 acres of desert along a creek that did not even have a proper road to it. A third was 21 years old when he bought 100 head of cattle that somebody else had already branded. And the fourth, the strangest deal of all, traded 3 million acres of barren panhandle for a single building made of granite. Together, at their peaks, these 4 ranches controlled nearly 5 million acres of the American West. That is more land than the states of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. They ran hundreds of thousands of cattle across territories larger than some European countries. They fought private wars on the frontier. They smuggled cotton through Mexico during the Civil War. They leased grazing land from the federal government on Indian territory that was never supposed to be leased. And when the cattle market collapsed, one of them found oil beneath the pastures and saved a dynasty that was weeks from the auction block. Every one of these empires nearly died. 2 of them did: the Waggoner Ranch, King Ranch, the 4 Sixes, and the XIT. This is the complete history of the 4 greatest ranch dynasties that Texas ever produced, how they were built, how they almost fell, and what happened to each of them. In the open-range era of Texas, before barbed wire carved the prairie into parcels and before courthouses had jurisdiction over anything past the county seat, a man's brand was the most important thing he owned. More binding than a deed, more recognizable than a face. In a world where cattle drifted across unfenced range for hundreds of miles and herds from a dozen different owners grazed the same grass, the brand burned into a cow's hide was the only proof of ownership that existed. The Waggoners burned 3 reverse Ds into every animal they owned. The Kings burned a symbol called the running W. Burke Burnett burned 4 sixes in a row, 6666. And the men who built the XIT branded their cattle with a mark so simple and so large that you could read it from horseback at a distance. 3 straight lines and 2 crosses that spelled out the name. 10 in Texas, 4 brands, 4 families, 4 very different fates. In the early 1850s, a man named Daniel Waggoner rode into Wise County, Texas with everything he had in the world. His total holdings amounted to 242 head of cattle and 6 horses. His son, W.T., known to everyone as Tom, rode beside him. So did a 15-year-old enslaved person whose name has not survived the historical record. 3 people, 242 cattle, and 6 horses. That was the entire Waggoner operation on the day it began. They settled along Catlet Creek, near what would later become the town of Decatur. The land was cheap because the land was empty. Wise County in the early 1850s sat at the very edge of the Texas frontier. Past it, there was nothing but Comanche territory and open grass stretching north to the Red River. The nearest market was weeks away by horseback. The nearest law was wherever the nearest man with a badge decided to ride. Daniel Waggoner registered his first brand as D61. It was short, plain, and forgettable. That was deliberate. In the 1850s, a distinctive brand attracted rustlers the same way a distinctive house attracted thieves. A brand that looked like every other brand in the county bought you time. The cattle multiplied. The grass was good. Wise County filled in around the Waggoners as more settlers pushed west, which meant more demand for beef and more competition for grazing land. Within a decade, Daniel needed more room. Around 1866, he changed the brand. The old D61 became 3 reversed Ds, a mark that was harder to alter with a running iron and easier to spot from a distance. The timing was calculated. The Civil War had just ended, the cattle trails to Kansas were opening, and the men who could get Texas beef to the northern railheads first stood to make fortunes. Daniel was positioning the Waggoner name for a larger stage. In the spring of 1870, Daniel and his son Tom drove a herd north along the cattle trails from Texas to Kansas. They sold the cattle at the railhead, loaded the money into saddlebags, and rode home. The profit from that single drive was $55,000, a sum that in today's dollars would exceed $1.3 million. One trip, one herd, one spring. That money funded everything that followed. By 1871, the Waggoners had moved their headquarters from Wise County to Clay County, pushing deeper into the Texas interior where the grass was thicker, the range was wider, and the competition was thinner. Their operation now stretched 30 miles, from China Creek to the Pease River. They were no longer a family with a herd, they were an empire in formation. Through the 1880s, the Waggoner outfit sold approximately 40,000 head of cattle per year. To understand what that number means, some entire counties in Texas at that time did not contain 40,000 people. The Waggoners were moving more animals through the market annually than many communities had residents. In 1885, Daniel began leasing what was called the Big Pasture, a stretch of Indian territory that belonged to the Comanche and Kiowa nations under federal treaty, but that the government was willing to rent out to Texas cattlemen who needed room to graze. The arrangement was legal, technically. It was also the kind of arrangement that would not survive the 20th century's conscience. By 1900, the Waggoner herds numbered 60,000 head. The family had introduced Durham Shorthorn cattle around 1885 to improve the stock, switched to Herefords in the early 1890s, and by 1917, the entire operation was running predominantly Hereford, a breed that handled the Texas heat better and brought higher prices at the rail yards. Between 1889 and 1903, the Waggoner Ranch expanded to its maximum footprint, more than 1 million acres, spread across 6 counties: Ford, Knox, Baylor, Archer, Wilbarger, and Wichita. The ranch measured roughly 30 miles east to west and 25 miles north to south. There was no other privately held property that size behind a single continuous fence line anywhere in the United States. That phrase, largest ranch under one fence, would follow the Waggoner name for the next century and beyond. It became as much a part of the brand as the 3 reversed Ds. Daniel Waggoner died in 1904. He was not a famous man. He had never run for office, never published a memoir, never given a speech that any newspaper considered worth printing. He had simply taken 242 cattle and 6 horses into an empty county in the early 1850s and turned them into a million-acre empire by the time he stopped breathing. His son Tom took over without ceremony and without contest. And then, 7 years later, the ground beneath the Waggoner Ranch opened up. In 1911, oil was discovered at Electra on Waggoner land. The family that had spent 60 years building the largest cattle empire behind a single fence in America was now sitting on top of one of the richest petroleum deposits in the Southwest. Overnight, the cattle operation that had built the empire became the least valuable asset on the property. A single good oil well could produce more revenue in a month than 60,000 head of cattle generated in a year. This should have been the ending. The triumphant, unambiguous storybook ending. A ranching family strikes oil, the fortune multiplies beyond calculation, the dynasty is secured forever. But dynasties are not secured by money, they are broken by it. And the breaking had already started, 2 years before the oil was found. At Christmas in 1909, W.T. Waggoner had gathered his 3 children and given them the greatest gift any of them would ever receive. He divided the ranch among them. 3 pieces, 3 owners. 3 people with 3 very different ideas about what a million-acre ranch with oil under it was actually for. Tom realized his mistake almost immediately. The division created chaos, competing management decisions, conflicting development plans, arguments over everything from cattle prices to mineral rights. By 1923, he had clawed the entire operation back into a single trust structure, reuniting the 3 pieces under one legal entity. But the damage was done. The children had tasted individual ownership. They had seen what their share was worth on paper. And inheritance, once divided, does not forget the division just because a lawyer puts it back together. Tom Waggoner died in 1934. His widow, Ella Halsell Waggoner, became the trustee. She held the operation together through the Depression, through the war, through the post-war boom. But when the next generation came of age, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had grown up wealthy, who had never ridden a cattle trail or slept on open ground, the lawsuits started. In 1967, a Waggoner heir named Buster Wharton died. His death triggered a legal battle over inheritance that lasted 6.5 years. The courts eventually recognized his son, Bucky Wharton III, as the rightful heir. But the case had pried open a fracture that no trust document could permanently seal. The Waggoner Ranch was worth far more as a collection of sellable assets than it was as a working ranch. By 1991, the ranch had contracted to approximately 520,000 acres, about half its peak, and two co-owners controlled it, Electra Waggoner Biggs and Bucky Wharton III. The property still held several hundred quarter horses, thousands of head of cattle, approximately 1,200 producing oil wells, mineral rights spanning 6 counties, and 30,000 acres of cultivated farmland. And the family could not agree on what to do with any of it. The land alone was appraised at $110 million. The total estate, cattle, horses, wells, minerals, equipment, farmland, was valued at approximately $330 million. In 2016, Stan Kroenke, the owner of the Los Angeles Rams and one of the wealthiest men in American sports, purchased the Waggoner Ranch in what was at that time the largest ranch transaction in American history. The sale made Kroenke the 9th largest private landowner in the United States. For the first time in more than 150 years, no one named Waggoner lived on the property. The 3 reversed Ds still mark the fence posts along 6 counties of North Texas. But the family that burned them into the first hide, the family that turned 242 cattle into 1 million acres and then watched it all sell for the price of a professional sports franchise, is gone. 2 years after Daniel Waggoner drove his 242 head into Wise County, a man named Richard King was steering a steamboat up the Rio Grande, 300 miles to the south. King was not a Texan. He was not even American by birth. He had been an Irish immigrant orphan on the streets of New York City, apprenticed to a jeweler at the age of 8, who stowed away on a ship bound for the Gulf Coast when he was 11. By his early 20s, he was captaining riverboats on the Rio Grande, hauling cargo between the Gulf of Mexico and the border towns that had sprung up along the river after the Mexican-American War. His business partner was a man named Mifflin Kennedy, and together they had built a small but profitable monopoly on Rio Grande River commerce. The steamboat trade was making both men wealthy, but King saw something that Kennedy did not, or at least something Kennedy did not act on. The land along the river was wild, ungoverned, and dangerous. The Mexican-American War had ended only 5 years earlier, and the border between Texas and Mexico was a line on a map that almost nobody respected. Bandits operated freely on both sides. Mexican raiders drove cattle north, Anglo settlers drove cattle south. The few authorities who existed had neither the manpower nor the interest to impose order on a territory the size of a small nation. King did not want order, he wanted control, and control in South Texas in the 1850s meant one thing: land. In 1853, Richard King purchased the Rincón de Santa Gertrudis, a 15,500-acre Spanish land grant situated along Santa Gertrudis Creek, deep in the brush country of South Texas. The price was approximately $300. The land was flat, thorny, sun-scorched, and almost entirely without infrastructure. No road connected it to any town. No water system served it beyond the creek itself. The Anglo settlers moving into Texas at the time considered it worthless, good for nothing except snakes and mesquite. King saw something they did not. He saw grass, and grass in the 1850s was cattle money. But land without labor was just dirt, and the nearest source of skilled cattle workers, vaqueros, who understood livestock, horsemanship, and the rhythms of open-range ranching, was not in Texas. It was across the border, in Mexico. King did something that no other Texas rancher of his generation attempted. He rode 120 miles south across the Rio Grande to the village of Kroenke in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. Kroenke was a small, impoverished community with limited prospects and no particular attachment to the land it occupied. King offered the entire village, men, women, children, families, the chance to relocate to his ranch. He promised them homes, wages, and protection. In return, they would work the cattle, build the infrastructure, and defend the land as if it were their own. They came. Entire families packed what they had and crossed the river to a ranch they had never seen, owned by a man most of them had never met, in a country that had conquered their country only 5 years earlier. The arrangement required an extraordinary amount of trust on both sides. These families became known as the Quineños, the king's people. They were not employees in the modern sense of the word. They lived on the ranch. Their children were born on the ranch. Their loyalty was to the King family personally, not to a paycheck or a contract. The system that King built at Santa Gertrudis more closely resembled a medieval hacienda than a 19th-century American business operation. It was feudal in structure, paternalistic in practice, and enormously effective as a labor model. The Quineños branded every animal on the ranch with a mark designed by King himself, the running W. A single, wavy line. Simple, distinctive, impossible to alter with a running iron without leaving obvious evidence of tampering. The running W would become one of the most recognizable cattle brands in the history of the American West. Over the next 3 decades, King made more than 60 separate land purchases, expanding the Santa Gertrudis Ranch into a contiguous empire that swallowed the brush country around it, parcel by parcel. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, King, who held no particular ideological loyalty to the Confederacy but possessed an absolute loyalty to profit, registered his steamboats under the Mexican flag and ran Confederate cotton downriver from the Texas interior to Matamoros, on the Mexican side of the border. There, the cotton was sold to European buyers who could not, under international law, be accused of trading directly with the Confederate States. It was a loophole large enough to drive a steamboat through. King drove several. The money from the cotton trade expanded the ranch. But when the war ended, the chaos along the border erupted. Between 1866 and 1875, King Ranch lost an estimated 34,000 head of cattle to cross-border raiding, armed bands of Mexican rustlers who drove herds south across the Rio Grande and vanished into territory where Texas law did not reach. King's response was not to petition a distant government for help it could not provide. He built watchtowers on the ranch's perimeter. He mounted naval artillery, actual cannons, salvaged from decommissioned military vessels on the ranch grounds. He fought a private war on his own land, with his own men and his own weapons. The Quineños were his army as much as they were his workforce. On April 14, 1885, Richard King died of stomach cancer at the Menger Hotel in San Antonio. He was 60 years old. The ranch he left behind measured 614,000 acres, nearly 1,000 square miles of South Texas. His estate carried roughly $500,000 in debt. His last words to his wife Henrietta were 5 words long: "Never sell a foot." Henrietta King was not a rancher. She was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister from Brownsville who had married a steamboat captain 30 years earlier and watched him turn empty desert into a private kingdom. She was 63 years old when he died. She was also not someone who bent. She inherited approximately 500,000 acres and $500,000 in debt, almost exactly $1 of obligation for every acre of land. The arithmetic was brutal. Selling portions of the ranch was the obvious solution. Lenders expected it. Neighbors anticipated it. A woman alone in 1885 Texas, with 500,000 acres and $500,000 in the red, was not expected to hold. She held. Henrietta identified a young lawyer named Robert Justice Kleberg, whom the family had hired to handle the estate's legal disputes. Kleberg was sharp, ambitious, and increasingly drawn to the ranching life. He was also drawn to King's youngest daughter, Alice. He married Alice, moved on to the ranch, and began the systematic work of restructuring the operation to service the debt without selling a single acre. Kleberg's most consequential decision was to lobby the St. Louis, Brownsville, and Mexico Railway to extend its line through King Ranch property. When the railroad agreed, the new station became the town of Kingsville, Texas, in 1904. The town generated lease revenue, gave King Ranch direct rail access to northern cattle markets for the first time, and kept property taxes manageable because the King family controlled the vast majority of the surrounding land. Under the Kleberg management, King Ranch also began developing what would become one of its most enduring contributions to American agriculture, a new breed of beef cattle called the Santa Gertrudis. The breed was a cross between Brahman cattle, which could survive the brutal South Texas heat but produced tough beef, and Shorthorn cattle, which produced excellent beef but wilted in the climate. The crossbreeding program ran for decades. The Santa Gertrudis was officially recognized by the USDA in 1940 as the first American breed of beef cattle, a distinction that remains unique in the history of American ranching. By the 1920s, King Ranch had expanded beyond even Richard King's ambitions. At its peak, the ranch encompassed 1.2 million acres, divided into 4 major divisions: Santa Gertrudis, Laureles, Norias, and Encino. Henrietta King died in 1925 at the age of 92. She had obeyed the command for 40 years. Every foot was intact. But the generation that followed her was about to face a threat that no amount of land or cattle or stubbornness could survive. By the early 1930s, King Ranch was carrying approximately $3 million in debt. The Great Depression had collapsed cattle prices. Revenue had dried up. The ranch's operational manager, Bob Kleberg Jr., Robert Justice Kleberg's son, Richard King's great-grandson by marriage, was staring at the arithmetic of ruin. At the rate the debt was compounding, the family would be forced to liquidate land within a matter of years. The deathbed command was about to be broken by interest payments. Kleberg had one idea that did not require violating the 5 words. The land might be more valuable for what lay beneath it than for what grazed on top of it. Texas was in the grip of an oil boom. Fortunes were being made in the Permian Basin, in East Texas, along the Gulf Coast. If King Ranch sat on a petroleum deposit, a drilling lease could pay the debt without selling a single acre of surface. Kleberg approached Gulf Oil. They examined the geology and declined. He approached Shell. They declined. He approached Texaco. They declined. 3 of the largest petroleum companies in the world looked at King Ranch and decided the subsurface formations were not promising enough to justify the risk. On September 26, 1933, Bob Kleberg Jr. signed an oil lease with Humble Oil, a smaller, less prestigious company that most of the Texas oil establishment considered a second-tier outfit. The deal happened because of one man, a geologist named Wallace E. Pratt, who studied the subsurface structures beneath the Santa Gertrudis Ranch and believed they showed promise. Pratt personally convinced Humble's management to take the gamble that Gulf, Shell, and Texaco had all refused. The first well on King Ranch did not come in until 1939. For 6 years, Humble drilled across the property without hitting a commercially viable strike. Millions were spent. Patience thinned. And then, in 1945, the Borregas field came in. It was enormous. King Ranch became one of the most productive private oil properties in the United States. The debt, all $3 million of it, was erased. The land was saved. The cattle operation that had nearly killed the ranch became the secondary business. The oil beneath the pastures became the primary one. Not a foot was sold. The command survived. In 1857, a family named Burnett packed their belongings in Bates County, Missouri, and made the long trek south to Denton County, Texas. Among them was a boy named Samuel, who answered to Burke. He was 8 years old. 12 years later, when Burke Burnett turned 21, he owned nothing. No land, no herd, no prospects beyond what his hands and his nerve could produce. What he had was a name and nerve. Nothing else. In 1870, Burnett purchased 100 head of cattle from a stock dealer in Denton named Frank Crowley. The cattle came pre-branded. Burned into every hide were 4 6s in a row. 6, 6, 6, 6. Burnett did not choose the brand. He inherited it with the purchase. But he kept it, And within a generation, those 4 digits would become one of the most recognized marks in the American West. There is a legend, and it has circulated for more than a century, that Burnett won the cattle in a poker game. The story goes that he was dealt 4 sixes, bet everything he had against the pot, and walked away from the table with 100 head and a brand. It is the kind of story that belongs in a Western. It is also, by Burnett's own repeated testimony, untrue. The ranch's historical records state plainly that the cattle were purchased for cash from Frank Crowley in Denton. Burnett denied the poker story multiple times during his lifetime, but he never sued a single newspaper that printed it. A man who builds an empire understands the value of a good origin story, even a false one, and 4 sixes dealt from a deck is a better opening line than a receipt from a cattle broker. By 1871, Burnett had established the 6666 Ranch near Guthrie in King County, Texas. He was 22 years old. The land he chose was hard country, flat, dry, wind-hammered, and dozens of miles from the nearest settlement of any consequence. Guthrie was not a town. It was a courthouse and a general store surrounded by grass. The kind of place where a young man with 100 head of cattle and an appetite for scale could expand without bumping into neighbors. Burnett had both the appetite and the discipline. Over the next 2 decades, the 6666 Ranch grew steadily, acquisition by acquisition, lease by lease, until the brand covered approximately 500,000 acres of Texas Panhandle and rolling plains. 500,000 acres. Nearly 800 square miles. To ride the perimeter of the 4 sixes at a walking pace would take a man on horseback more than a week without sleeping. The scale was formidable. But what set Burnett apart from the dozens of other ranchers who controlled large acreages in the 1880s was not the size of his operation. It was his organizational intelligence. Burnett became one of the founding members of the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, the TSCRA, which was created to fight the single greatest economic threat to the Texas cattle industry: organized rustling. In the 1880s and 1890s, cattle theft was not petty crime, it was big business. Organized rings of rustlers operated across the Panhandle, altering brands with running irons, portable branding tools that could turn one letter into another, one number into a different number, if the original brand was poorly designed. A 6 could become an 8, a D could become an O. An entire herd's identity could be erased in a single afternoon. The stolen cattle would be driven north across the Red River into Indian Territory, beyond the reach of Texas jurisdiction, and sold to buyers who did not ask questions. The TSCRA hired its own brand inspectors, men who operated in the gray area between law enforcement and bounty hunting, to track stolen cattle, identify altered brands, and either recover the animals or ensure the thieves faced prosecution. Burnett served as the association's treasurer for 45 consecutive years. No other officer in the TSCRA's history held a position for that long. The 4 sixes survived the droughts that killed smaller operations. It survived the market crashes of the 1880s. It survived the fence-cutting wars, when desperate small ranchers slashed the barbed wire of larger operations in a last stand against the enclosure of the open range. The brand held. The land held. The operation continued. But the world that had built the 4 sixes, the open range, the cattle trail, the handshake economy where a man's word and his brand were the only contracts that mattered, was ending. Barbed wire had closed the open range by the 1890s. The railroad had replaced the cattle drive, and the frontier that had allowed a 21-year-old with $100 and 100 head of cattle to become one of the most powerful cattlemen in Texas was gone. What was left was the ranch, the brand, and the question of whether either would last beyond the man who built them. Burke Burnett was born on January 1, 1849 in Bates County, Missouri. He arrived in Texas before he turned 10. He built an empire before he turned 30, and the brand he bought for $100 from a dealer in Denton, the 4 sixes, simple, bold, unforgettable, outlasted everything else about the era that produced it. On November 9, 1881, the Texas State Capitol building in Austin caught fire. The building, a limestone structure that had served the state government since before the Civil War, burned to its foundations. Texas needed a new capital. The state treasury did not have the money to build one. What Texas did have was land, an almost incomprehensible amount of land. The state still held title to millions of acres in its western reaches, territory that had been part of the Republic of Texas and that, unlike public land in other states, had never been ceded to the federal government. Texas owned its own unsettled land, and in 1881, most of that land sat in the Panhandle, hundreds of miles from the nearest city, with no water infrastructure, no railroad access, and no population. The legislature proposed a solution that, in hindsight, reads less like fiscal policy than like the opening play of the largest land speculation scheme in American history. Texas would offer 3 million acres of panhandle territory, enough to fill 10 entire counties, to any private group willing to build a new Capitol building in exchange. No cash, no bonds, no appropriation. 3 million acres of dirt for one building made of Texas granite. The land sat in the far northwestern corner of the state, along the New Mexico border, stretching roughly 220 miles from north to south. It was flat, treeless, waterless, and almost entirely uninhabited by anyone except Comanche hunters who had been using it for generations and were in the process of being forced off. To the Texas legislature, this was surplus inventory, an embarrassment of acreage in a state that had more territory than it could populate. A group of 4 businessmen from Illinois took the deal. Charles B. Farwell and his brother John V. Farwell, both well-connected Chicago investors, joined forces with Amos C. Babcock and Abner Taylor to form the Capitol Freehold Land and Investment Company. They were not cattlemen. They were not Texans. They were financiers who saw an opportunity to acquire 3 million acres at the cost of a single construction project. The new Capitol building cost exactly $3,744,630.60 to construct. The syndicate's own operational expenditures during the building process totaled $3,224,593.45. These were not small sums, 0.45. These were not small sums in the 1880s. To finance the entire operation, John Farwell traveled to London and spent months persuading British investors, among them the Earl of Aberdeen, to commit approximately $5 million in capital. The British put up the money, the Farwells managed the deal, and Texas got its granite dome. The ranch was named the XIT. The brand stood for 10 in Texas, 10 counties worth of territory under a single mark. Dallam, Hartley, Oldham, Deaf Smith, Palmer, Castro, Bailey, Lamb, Cochran, Hockley. 10 names on a map, 3 million acres on the ground. The first herd arrived on July 1, 1885. 2,500 head of cattle, driven from the south, entered a property that most of them would never leave. By November of 1886, less than 18 months later, the XIT held 110,721 head of cattle, with an appraised value of $1,322,587. But 3 million acres of empty panhandle presented a logistics problem that no American ranch had ever attempted to solve. There was no water. There were no fences. There were no roads, no corrals, no line camps, no windmills, nothing except grass and sky and 220 miles of open ground that needed to be enclosed, watered, and managed. The infrastructure campaign that followed was the most ambitious private construction project in the history of the American ranching industry. By the turn of the century, the XIT had erected 1,500 miles of fencing, roughly the distance from Houston to Chicago. By 1886 alone, crews had completed 781 miles of wire. They had drilled and installed 325 windmills and built 100 dams to create stock water across the property, at a combined cost of approximately $500,000 just for the water system. The ranch was divided into 94 individual pastures spread across 8 named divisions: Buffalo Springs, Middle Water, Ojo Bravo, Alamacitas, Rita Blanca, Escarbada, Spring Lake, and Yellow House, also known by its Spanish name, Casas Amarillas. At peak operation, the XIT was a machine. After 1887, the ranch maintained an average of approximately 150,000 head of cattle. Every year, 12,500 head were driven north to remote pastures, a practice that continued annually for 11 consecutive years, the largest sustained cattle movement in Panhandle history. 150 cowboys worked the ranch at its peak, riding a string of 1,000 horses. In a single branding season, the crews marked 35,000 calves. The cowboys were paid $25 to $30 per month, standard wages for the era, applied at a scale that was anything but standard. The first general manager was a man known across the Panhandle as Barbecue Campbell, B.H. Campbell, whose nickname's origin the historical record has not troubled itself to explain. On January 1, 1888, Campbell was replaced by Albert G. Boyce, a more systematic manager who oversaw the XIT through its years of peak production. Henry S. Boyce took over in 1905, presiding over the beginning of the end. Because the XIT was always ending. From the very first fence post, it was designed to end. The syndicate that built the ranch had never wanted to be cattlemen. They were land speculators. The cattle were a holding play, a way to generate income from 3 million acres while they waited for the Panhandle to develop, for the railroad to extend, for the land to appreciate in value enough to justify parceling it off to settlers and farmers. The ranch was never the point. The real estate was the point. But real estate in the Texas Panhandle did not appreciate at the rate British investors expected when they committed $5 million. The railroad came slowly. Settlement came slower. The land was productive as rangeland, but marginal as farmland, and the people who wanted to buy it could not offer prices that would satisfy men who had financed a state capital in exchange for it. On November 1, 1912, the XIT sold its last head of cattle. The ranch, as a working ranch, ceased to exist after 27 years. What remained was a land company that owned an enormous amount of flat, treeless, waterless Panhandle acreage and no cows. By 1929, 450,000 acres still sat in syndicate hands. By 1943, the holdings had shrunk to approximately 350,000 acres. The parcels were sold in pieces throughout the mid-20th century, to farmers, to smaller ranchers, to oil companies, to anyone willing to pay the asking price for a section of Panhandle that had never belonged to a family, never been a homestead, never carried any meaning beyond the arithmetic of investment return. The last parcel of XIT land was sold in 1963. 81 years after the Texas legislature traded 3 million acres for a building, every last acre had been liquidated. The Capitol still stands in Austin. The granite dome still rises over Congress Avenue. The XIT brand, 10 in Texas, the largest ranch the world had ever seen, exists only in photographs, in county museum displays, and in the name of a reunion celebration that the Panhandle towns still hold every summer for people who remember that this land once wore a brand. Of the 4 empires, 2 survived into the 21st century intact. 2 did not. The XIT was the first to disappear, and in some ways the easiest to explain. It was never a ranch in the way the others were. It was a financial instrument shaped like a cattle operation. No family built it, no patriarch bled for it. No deathbed command bound future generations to its soil. When the instrument matured and the returns fell short, the cattle were sold and the land was parceled out. The brand vanished from the Panhandle as cleanly as if it had never been burned into a hide. The Waggoner Ranch lasted far longer, more than 150 years of continuous family operation. But the Christmas gift of 1909 planted a fracture line that took a century to crack the surface. Daniel Waggoner had built the ranch on unity, one brand, one fence, one family pulling in one direction. Tom Waggoner's gift divided that unity into thirds. And once the oil came, once the mineral rights made each third worth more money than any of the heirs had ever imagined, the centrifugal force became stronger than any trust document or family loyalty could contain. The lawsuits, the settlements, the 6.5-year inheritance battles, and finally, in 2016, the signature on a deed that transferred 520,000 acres, 1,200 oil wells, and the 3 Reverse D's brand to a man from Missouri who already owned the Los Angeles Rams, the Denver Nuggets, and Arsenal Football Club. Stan Kroenke became the 9th largest private landowner in the United States. And for the first time since the early 1850s, for the first time since Daniel Waggoner rode into Wise County with 242 cattle and 6 horses, no Waggoner walked the land. The 4 Sixes survived. The brand that Burke Burnett purchased from Frank Crowley in 1870 still marks cattle in Guthrie, Texas, in King County, where it has operated continuously for more than 150 years. The ranch changed hands. Ownership passed through Burnett's descendants and eventually to new stewards, but the brand, the land, and the working cattle operation continued as a single, unbroken piece. The quarter horse program that the 6666 made famous still produces some of the most respected working horses in the American West. The ranch is still a ranch. The cowboys still ride. The 4 Sixes still burn into the hide of every calf born on the property. And King Ranch, the empire that a steamboat captain purchased for $300 in 1853, still stands at 825,000 acres. 4 divisions, Santa Gertrudis, Laurelis, Nereus, Encino. Still family-controlled, still operational. The Caneno families whose ancestors walked north from Cruyas, Mexico in the 1850s still live in Kingsville, Texas. Their descendants still work the land. The Santa Gertrudis cattle breed that took decades to develop still grazes the pastures. The Running W brand that Richard King designed to resist alteration by rustlers still burns into every calf. Not a foot was sold. The command held. 5 words spoken by a dying man in a San Antonio hotel room in 1885 governed the decisions of 6 subsequent generations and preserved 825,000 acres of South Texas across 2 world wars, a Great Depression, an oil boom, a succession crisis, and 140 years of American history. 4 men, 4 brands, 4 empires cut from dirt that the rest of the country considered worthless. Daniel Waggoner started with 242 cattle and built the largest ranch behind a single fence that America had ever seen. Richard King paid $300 for a Spanish land grant and built a kingdom that outlasted every other private landholding in the history of the state. Burke Burnett bought somebody else's cattle and turned a purchased brand into a 500,000-acre operation and a 45-year reign as the most powerful cattleman's treasurer in the West. And a group of Illinois financiers traded a granite building for 3 million acres and the largest ranch the world had ever known. None of them planned for what came after. Waggoner gave it away at Christmas and spent the rest of his life trying to take it back. King told his wife to hold it with 5 words and left her with $500,000 of debt to figure out how. Burnett left a brand and a legend he spent his whole life denying. And the XIT partners took their investment returns, closed the books, and went home to Chicago. The land did not notice. The land was there before Daniel Waggoner's first cow grazed on it, and it is there now. 825,000 acres of King Ranch, 520,000 acres of what used to be Waggoner country, the Guthrie pastures of the 4 Sixes, and the flat, open stretch of Panhandle where 10 counties of XIT grass once carried 150,000 head and 150 cowboys and 1,500 miles of wire. The brands change, the fences move, the families rise, and the families fall. The dirt stays. If you have been watching all the way to this point, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Which of these 4 ranches do you think had the most remarkable story? And if you want to see a deeper dive into any single one of them, let me know which one. If you enjoyed this, you might want to check out our video on the most legendary ranch empire that most people have never heard of. I will see you in the next one.